animal welfare and animal ethics. It's going to be a very simple introduction. The topics I want to consider is what is animal welfare, give you some definitions that I use. They're not rigid definitions.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Certainly. Some definitions on animal welfare and some other definitions because some words get a little bit confusing. I want to spend a bit of time on ethics in distinguishing right from wrong and how can one use a systematic approach in trying to analyse an ethical dilemma. A dilemma where you really are not sure what the right thing to do is. I'll just give you some approaches to help you think that through. I won't tell you what to conclude, but I'll help you in the thinking process which allows you to develop your own decision making. If we have time, I'll then move on to forms of animal suffering, because that is an important component of animal welfare science. I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka. This is the first time I've been here, so I do not know a lot about Sri Lanka. However, I'll give you a European's perspective of some of the animal welfare issues that we hear about in Europe, in Sri Lanka. What do we get to hear about? So, let's start. I define animal welfare as a concern for animal suffering, for animal happiness. It's something that we have. It's our perception of what the animal is going through. So, animal welfare doesn't have a single measure. It isn't actually easy to assess. It encompasses a range of conditions, but it's our interpretation of what we think the animal is experiencing. It's something in ourselves. So animal welfare science is the science of animal suffering and animal happiness, and clearly that has to be assessed in different ways according to the context and the type of condition that you are considering. The same applies to animal disease, doesn't it, and animal health. There are many issues, I think, in each country about animal welfare, and every country has its own particular issues. Some are more unique to the country, and I think that Sri Lanka has some very unique animal welfare issues. These topics here, which I've come across from where I am in Europe, are, I think, unique to Sri Lanka. I haven't heard of comparable situations in other countries. I'll be very interested to hear your views about how some of these should be improved or managed. When considering some of the issues that I've been showing you on that slide, an analysis that I often use in trying to understand how important the welfare compromise is, I use this equation here. W, which is the importance of the animal welfare problem, is proportional to the number of animals affected, the intensity of their suffering, the duration of their suffering, and the capacity of the animal to suffer for the particular concern that you have. And that obviously has importance when considering species that are not mammals, for example. We don't have a really good understanding of the ways in which fish or prawns or shrimp can suffer, for example. So I often use that equation just to help me think through whether this particular subject we're discussing is important or not in the overall picture. I'm open to a lot of suggestions as to which topics during discussion that we can consider. But as you can see from here, the ones which I've heard about in Sri Lanka would be control of snakes, control of street dogs, the use of gun tracks, the control or deterring animals which are a nuisance for crops, whether it be elephants or whether it be flying foxes or fruit bats, poaching, and a range of other conditions. Some of them relate to wildlife, and some obviously relate to companion animals and production animals. I've given you a definition for animal welfare. Let's consider now definitions for animal rights and some of the other words on this slide. I look upon animal rights in a similar way to when we use the term human rights. In human rights, we're looking for freedom of activity and actions and freedom from oppression. There are two components: freedom to act according to the way that you want to, and freedom from oppression. So in the case of gender rights or religious rights or race rights, cultural rights, it's freedom from oppression. In the case of freedom of action, it might be freedom to move within a country, because in some countries it can be closely controlled. Now in animal rights, it's a similar sort of situation. It's freedom to act and it's freedom from oppression. However, animal rights, the word, has been somewhat distorted, because in some parts of the world there are activists who are militant in their approach to trying to increase interest in animal rights. They are actually disruptive, and so some people use the word animal rights to refer to extremists who are trying to advocate animal rights. But in its strict terms, it's the former definition. Animal liberation. That is a more extreme form of animal rights. It's freedom from dominion by humans. So that means, for example, you shouldn't keep a songbird in a cage because you're controlling it, you're confining it. It should be, according to the animal liberation perspective, allowed to live freely and naturally in its own environment in which it evolved. Similarly, for zoo animals, the animal liberation person would say that is quite inappropriate. Not all of us share that view, clearly, but some of us have an animal rights outlook at some level. Clearly, we will differ in the degree to which we support animal rights, though. And it's getting harmony in that spread which is particularly challenging. Ethics, I look upon as trying to distinguish right from wrong. How do you, when you confront a dilemma, come to a decision making about what is right and what is wrong? It can be based on religion, it can be based on your veterinary professional judgment about what is the best thing for the animal. It might take into account the national interest, or it might be the greater good of society. There are a lot of things that come into ethics. It's not just your moral opinion. It covers everything. So this moral component is just one facet of ethics. In the case of etiquette, that means behaving like a professional. So an important behavior pattern in the veterinary profession is client confidentiality. That comes under the wording of etiquette. It's good behavior not to talk about another client to another client as well. Okay. So those are some simple definitions, so we will probably talk about using the same language. I'd like to move on now to considering when is suffering unacceptable and when is it something you've just got to live with? When is it just something to be accepted or tolerated? And my next picture, I will use 4 approaches to analyse this. In each of these, I'll give you case examples. The first way of analysing what is right or what is wrong is what I call an is it fair analysis. And you ask 3 questions. Is it fair on the animal? Is it necessary? And are there alternatives? The second analytical approach is compiling an advantages and disadvantages list, and I'll use chickens for that example. The third example is compliance with 5 freedoms, and I'll do, lastly, what I call a SOCLAP analysis. So I'm going to take you through these 4 examples in turn. Let's start then with the is it fair analysis. This is a type of analysis that's used widely by society, but it is actually useful in the veterinary profession as well. Let's look at this case. This is no longer practiced. This picture was taken about 12 years ago. There's a village in the south of Spain where they have every year, it's a Catholic village, every year at the time of the patron saint for the particular church, they get a goat. They blindfold the goat and they take it up to the belfry, the bell tower in the church, and they throw the goat out of the belfry. It doesn't do the goat much good. And as you can see from here, we've got the shadow on the wall. And the moral questions that we would be asking, or the ethical questions that we'd be asking, is this fair on the animal? Is it necessary? And are there alternatives? So the first thing we have to know is, why do they do it? And the reason for that is it's symbolic. What they're doing is they're casting the devil out of the church, and the goat symbolises the devil. They do it each year, at least they used to. I'll mention why they don't do it anymore. They used to do it each year as part of a religious ceremony. Now, is it fair on the animal? The answer to that, quite clearly, is not, because the goat is purely symbolic of the devil. It is not the devil itself. So it is grossly unfair to the individual animal. Secondly, is it necessary? Well, I suppose one might say it's a bad community that has to cast the devil out of the church every year. Something's going seriously wrong in the community if it has to be repeated at that sort of rate. Are there alternatives? Clearly there are alternatives. It could be a stuffed goat. It doesn't have to be a live conscious goat, or it could be a goat on a head halter led out of the church. Now, the people in this community have accepted that sort of argument, that sort of logic, and so they say, we'll stop it. And it's no longer allowed. And that's good. That's a good outcome. What I've shown you is with rather an unusual example of how you can do that type of analysis, and it can be applied in many other situations. It could be applied, for example, to gamecock fighting. Now, I don't expect gamecock fighting is done in this country, but it's common in some Asian countries, and particularly in South America. And it's part of a social activity. It's a social get-together. The gamecock fighting is peripheral, in fact, to actually the social gathering that happens at this particular time. You could use the same analysis. You could use the same analysis for a whole range of situations where there are welfare issues. It may be confinement in a zoo, going right through to animal neglect. And these I've chosen because they may be particularly relevant to the Sri Lankan situation. I'll do this analysis once more, and I'll do it again on an unusual example, but by using an unusual example, it'll get you to see how to think about analysing a new situation. Here we have a urine farm. The slide was taken in Canada, and it's a very cold climate, as you appreciate, in Canada. They keep pregnant mares stalled in this barn, and as you can see from the rear end of the pregnant mare, they are collecting urine through a hose which goes down to a vessel which drains the urine. Urine is then taken to a pharmaceutical factory, and it's used for extracting chemicals which are used in treating osteoporotic people. So it's part of the natural hormone replacement therapy based on estrogens for helping to strengthen bones. It's a natural product. Because it's natural, some people prefer it to the alternative, which would be synthetic estrogens, synthetic steroids. Now, what we might ask is this system fair? Is it necessary? Are there alternatives? Because this is actually an ethical, bye-bye, hello, is an ethical problem. Some medical practitioners refuse to write prescriptions for natural estrogens, for natural estrogens derived from pregnant mares, because they believe that is an unethical way of keeping animals. Now, you, the professional, would probably say, I want to know a bit more about this. What are the problems? What are the problems, potential problems with the animal? So, you would probably go along, want to visit a site to make your own judgment. You'd look at confinement. Do these animals get sufficient exercise? Clearly, you have to collect the urine, and so they're going to be stalled for a large part of the day. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting some of the urine, obviously. So how often do they go out for exercise, and is it a sufficient exercise? Are they frustrated and bored in their stalls? Do they have sufficient social interaction? They've certainly got a neighbour, probably on one side, if not both sides. Is that sufficient to fulfil their needs, according to your judgment? Clearly, in any animal that's closely confined, there is a risk of skin sores, particularly where you're collecting urine. They could get a urine scald around the rear end. They may get leg problems through chronic confinement as well. So you may want to know what the treatment records are for contact injuries in these animals on the skin. Also, in this situation in Canada, it's a cold environment, so they're going to be not ventilating the shed very effectively in order to keep the temperature up. That poses a risk for respiratory disorders, so you, the professional, will probably be saying, I want to see the medical records for treatment for respiratory disease, please. Then you could form your own judgment as to whether the risks are high or whether they look as though they're actually being managed quite well. Your own judgment. Is it necessary? Well, it's market-driven, isn't it? It's a natural treatment for osteoporosis. There is a call for it amongst the community. So you could say, yes, that is one element of it being necessary. But are there alternatives? And yes, there are. There are synthetic hormone replacement therapy treatments. However, some people are sensitive to them. They prefer the naturals because they have less of a reaction to the particular compounds. The synthetics tend to be slightly more expensive than the natural compounds, though. That's worth keeping in mind. So, using that analysis, you would probably come up with a framework like this. And then you would make your final judgment on the individual components that you've considered. Let's now go to an advantages-disadvantages analysis. And here I'm going to choose castration. This shows obviously rubber ring castration, but this should also apply to, in case of cattle, using the bedizo or the emasculator. Same thing. In this, you just look at the advantages and you list them, and you look at the disadvantages from everybody's perspective. You don't just confine it to the animal welfare or the animal suffering component. So here, very briefly, it's control over the breeding program. That's why they do it. It actually serves a function. It avoids unwanted pregnancy, which can lead to stunting in females if mating is too early. It's ease and safety of handling in male cattle. Clearly, that is an important component. But the disadvantages of it are the stress of actually manhandling the animal, restraining it in order to apply the castration procedure, the pain involved in administering castration, post-operative pain. There can be last for a few weeks in some animals, so slower growth after castration. In some methods, there might be a risk of tetanus, for example. It's not a high risk, but it's something you should include. And it can lead to fatter carcasses, which may actually be something that's not wanted by the market. So this shows you another way of analysing a welfare issue. Advantages, disadvantages list doesn't tell you what to conclude, but it does tell you how to go about a comprehensive analysis. I expect you've just had a lecture which included the 5 freedoms, and this can be used also as an analytical tool. The 5 freedoms isn't quite what I would call ethics. It's more a moral outlook. It's just one part of ethics. You're looking at it solely from the animal's perspective. And you're saying that animals should have entitlements. They actually have rights. Or, if you don't like the word rights, you could use the word they have needs. Clearly, they have a need for adequate nutrition and watering. Clearly, they have a need for sufficient comfort in the stabling or the caging or the holding conditions that are used. Freedom from pain, if not management of pain. And a difficult one, freedom to express normal or natural behaviours. That actually is probably the most difficult one to achieve, particularly in intensive livestock production systems. The last one is freedom from fear and distress, and that one actually sometimes is unachievable. If you are moving an animal from one place to another, you actually depend on an element of fear in order to get it to oblige you in where it goes. So some people actually cross out fear and they just say freedom from distress. So to do this analysis, you can use this as an analytical method. Here, I'm going to compare caged birds with birds kept under a loose housing system, which you can see here. Now this is quite an intensive loose housing system. You can see it's got vertical platforms or layers, so you can house more birds in the shed than if it was just on the floor. Neither of these systems may be typical in this country, but I can assure you they are common elsewhere. Let's look at it from that perspective. First freedom was freedom from hunger and thirst. And if the farmer is any good at his job, whatever system he's using, whether it's cages or loose housing, it should be adequate. There's nothing peculiar about the system which could affect nutrition or drinking. Discomfort, however, is markedly different. In the cage environment here, this is much less comfortable, especially for the animal's feet, because you've got a wire floor. And in addition, they don't have some comfort features such as roosting at night, which is a behavioural need for animals, and they wouldn't have that comfort. And also comfort associated with the feeding mechanism. They're actually feeding downward on a slope. In order to allow the eggs to roll out of the cages, the slope of the floor is downwards, and so they're in a somewhat difficult position when it comes to feeding. But they have to learn how to adapt to that. Whereas in this system, they can make their own comfort much more. They can actually form a nest if they want to and do dust bathing on the floor, and they're at freedom to provide for their own comfort, even though they have a wire floor. Freedom from pain. Believe it or not, this system can be worse. When chickens lay a lot of eggs, they are turning over a lot of body calcium, producing calcium in the egg shell. This makes them prone to osteopenia, so that means demineralization of bone, very thin bone. And in this lifestyle, they're prone to flight accidents. Chickens are not the best flyers, and they develop accidents, and so the clavicle and the sternum are quite often broken. In some studies, as many as a quarter of the birds develop fractures during the laying period, right up to the time of the end of laying. So it's quite a high frequency. N is quite high. Whereas in this system, they're much more protected from that. They will get broken bones when they come to be pulled out of the cages and at the end of laying period and they're no longer wanted. So there, they do get a high frequency of broken bones, similar to the loose housing system, but it's for a shorter period. So D is lower. Okay, so that fills in that issue, just one aspect of pain. Freedom to express normal behaviour is, as you well appreciate, markedly different. And this is where the outstanding differences lie. Here, the birds cannot forage. They can't look for food. They can't investigate or explore. They can't dust bathe. They can't nest build, which is quite an important behavioural need for birds. They just don't have the facilities to do it. Sometimes they do what's called phantom nest building. So they'll sit on the floor and they'll pick up a piece of imaginary straw, which doesn't exist, and just put it by the side. You can see phantom-like behaviours because of the urge or the need to actually fulfill that behavioural drive, nest building. They can't run. They can't take more than 2 paces in one direction without having to do something else. They have limited ability to stretch their wings. They are in a very compromised position from the point of view of their behavioural needs. Here, the situation is better. It's not perfect. They don't have a proper nest. They can pretend to make a nest on this dirt floor. They can do dust bathing though. So around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, they'll all be at it, making a really dusty environment. Generally, a much more rewarding environment. But foraging, again, isn't a particularly strong ability, strong facility here, unless if they can go outside. Let's move on to the last one. That's freedom from fear and distress. And I think the conclusion is there that there are problems with both systems. You get, in this system, victimised birds, the one that's actually frightened of its flock mates. This is can be very large group sizes, unnaturally large group sizes. The natural group size would be a cockerel, and maybe 4 or 5 hens, and the chicks that follow. That would be, in the jungle fowl, maybe a large family group. But here, in some sheds, some units, in some countries, you have many thousands of birds. So, the victimised, the bird that seems to be frightened of crowds, doesn't do well. So that's how you would do an analysis, and you can see it can be very, very complex. But it's the necessary procedure when doing a 5 freedoms or an advantages and disadvantages type of analysis. In the remaining time, I'd like to do what is called a SOCLAP analysis. And SOCLAP is an acronym, S for society, O for oneself, C for client, L for law, A for animal, P for practice, and P for profession. A very simple way of remembering how to try and cover most of the interests when it comes to a veterinary ethical dilemma. So let's say you have a potential conflict situation between what you think is right, what is in the best interest of the animal, what is in the best interest of the client, and let's say there's a society perspective as well. You would be looking at it with an independent mind from each of those parties' concerns. And you'd say, right, what would society expect me to do in this situation? Or what's in the best interest of the animal? Or what is the client wanting me to do? And you bring that together and you make an analysis going down it as to formulating, which will help you formulate a decision in all likelihood, because you'll be surprised how sometimes it comes out pointing in one direction. Let's take an example. I'm not sure how appropriate this example is in the case of Sri Lanka, so forgive me if it is not totally relevant. But in some countries, medical doctors are legally required to report cases of child abuse. Now, I believe that's the case here. Is that correct? Yes? Right. Are veterinarians legally required to report cases of animal abuse? Legally, yes or no? No? Okay. should they be legally required to report to the police or to an appropriate authority cases of animal abuse? That's the question we're going to ask. And we'll use a SOCLAP analysis, not necessarily to tell us what to think, but just to cover all perspectives. What would society expect in a case of suspected animal abuse? They'd probably say the vets have a role in protecting animals against cruelty. That's a given. Animal abuse can be the starting point for a pathological, a socio-pathological problem in the culprit. It can lead to child abuse. It can lead to other misdemeanors and other unpleasant behaviour patterns. So that adds importance to the veterinarian's responsibility to do something about it. So society will be looking at the vet and saying, I think you should be doing something about it. I can't necessarily tell you what to do, but something should be done. We've got a problem here. Oneself. So how do you feel personally about this? Does your sense of duty lie more strongly with client confidentiality than with reporting a suspected case of cruelty? Now, in some countries, and I don't know whether this applies in Sri Lanka, I apologise, there is a pastime amongst the sectors of the community of dog fighting. Do you have dog fighting here? No. What happens is, some people rear aggressive breeds of dogs in order to have a competition in a fighting contest. And they gamble on it, they put money on it, and the winner gets the prize money. And as you can imagine, it leads to quite a lot of skin injuries, and sometimes more serious injuries than that, in the dogs. So let's say you were a practitioner overseas, and you were presented with a dog which had got lots of puncture wounds in its skin, and you immediately suspect that it's been fighting or been used for fighting, but you can't be certain. You're not actually sure, but it's a definite risk. So clearly you would go up to the owner who's brought it in and say, how did this happen? You wouldn't go in and say, you've been dog fighting, have you? You would be more diplomatic than that. You would say, tell me the story, what happened? Because you don't want the owner to be defensive. Then, and if the owner says, well, it was all right last night, but when I opened the kennel door, it was like this, you know, and you think, well, I'm not so sure about that. So you're not getting a very clear message as to what happened in this particular case. So you're then you're in a difficult position as to whether you should be exploring this further, or whether you actually accept the person's comments on faith, and also you respect an element of client confidentiality. If you end up by raising a charge against this person, they're not going to come to you again. They came to you expecting a service from you to help restore the dog. And so the last thing they expected